There you are. The Old School, Part 3. The grand finale, really. The grand finale. Borley-Kirk. Okay, now Borley-Kirk deserves special mention, as they say. Excuse me. Now, Borley retired in, I think, about March of 1952. Therefore, he would have been, say, 65, and therefore he would have been born in about 1887, I think. I know nothing about his career in any detail. I know that he would have been born in, it would have been about 1887, I would have thought. That would have made him about the same age as Totty. He went to the Brisbane Grammar School. That didn't necessarily mean that he was of the quality or anything like that. It simply meant because where else did you go? It was the grammar school. There were no state high schools in those days. And I think when he finished at the grammar school, there was a school in Brisbane in Edward Street, you know, that big building there. It used to be Queensland Tourist Bureau was there. I don't know what they call the building, but anyway, it's in Edward Street, and that was the location. It was called then the Normal School. Now, Normal School worldwide is usually a teacher training institution, and maybe he went there. But anyway, he received teacher training of some kind, and he became a teacher. And he was Douglas Franklin Kirk. And so, eventually, after whatever number of years, his career and my career coincided at the Charleville State School. Borley came there in 1935. It was said that he had asthma. Must have been a fairly serious condition. And he was sent to Charleville and remained in Charleville because of its dry climate. And so what did he have? That would be, that's 15, 16 years, 17 years, whatever it may have been in Charleville. And of course, by the time I got there, I felt that he was one of those eternal fixtures. I did say, I think, in one of the Old School Part 1, I said, you know, he did some terrible things and, you know, and there must have been some good things to be said about him. Well, since then, I've been trying to think of what those good things may have been. Well, you know, I mean, I'm usually not lost for an answer, but I can tell you what, this one's really tested me. But I think the good thing that you would say about him is that old Borley had a concept of what a principal was, a concept of what a principal did. And he made sure that he met that particular view of things. It was not a view that... It didn't endear him certainly to the students. We're frightened of him. He was a fairly big man. Bald, of course. Oh, bald. Look at this. This is like a jungle in comparison with old Borley. And he's had a singe too, I might add. That was vanity, I'm absolutely certain. A singe indeed. But anyway, we were quite frightened of him. He did nothing to endear himself. He was august. And he had a vocabulary. He used to walk around the school from time to time, always carried a cane with him, which he would swish. You know, I can't demonstrate here because this phone will only take in so much. But if you can picture me with a cane in my hand, swishing it against my leg. And so old Borley would go around switching this cane around his leg. And I think it was, you know, a bit excessive, I thought. And, you know, I mean, he was there and he would dish out the cane to malefactors from time to time, even those with pepperina on their hands. And he had that pitty little office that was there. Excuse me. And he would appear in a classroom every now and then. Well, we would freeze when Borley walked in. And I wouldn't mind betting that the teachers nearly pooped their pants also. You know, he was a man to be feared, and I suppose his concept of his role was just that. He was the head teacher, the man to be feared, but I don't think that was, altogether necessary, but anyway, that was how, and that was the good thing to say about old Borley. He had a concept that he thought was a valid one, and he stuck to it. He would appear in the classroom, and he would say, and the teacher would be struck, because Borley would come in and he would say, "I am going to give you a poser." Oh, well, okay, poser is a question for those of you who don't know. we were a bit mystified, but he would give us a poser. Okay, then he'd give us a poser, and we might look at him blankly, and he'd say, "Cogitate, cogitate." Oh, God, cogitate. Oh, look, I tell you, I blush when I think of it even now and then. But he liked Kath Harriman. Now, Kath in those days used to have, I think she had sort of ringlet curls or something, if I remember rightly. But old Borley used to think that Kathleen and her ringlet curls were very lovely. And he always treated her very kindly. Now, I don't think anyone else in the class got treated kindly, but Kathleen did, and I could still see him there in that grade 5 room, standing there, swishing the cane, and "Cogitate, boy, cogitate." Oh, for God's sake. Okay, there we are. But anyway, old Borley had a wife, a woman called Agnes, a little woman, tiny little woman, lovely woman. Well, I suppose she was lovely. But, she didn't have any of the presents that old Borley himself had. She was the dutiful wife. She used to wash his, what are they called? Creams, that's right. Because we'd get home to the playing field and we'd look out at the clothesline from the head teacher's house, and old Borley's creams would be on the clothesline. These were the clothes that he wore to bowls. You didn't wear white. I think they were called creams. They were not quite white. They were a slightly creamy colour. Anyway, he used to have his creams hanging out there, and, his intimates, so to speak. And I think, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Fancy Borley having intimates. But anyway, Borley had intimates and creams and all that sort of thing, and they were on the clothesline. But anyway, Borley's wife was Agnes. And Borley and Agnes, as far as I know, I don't know whether they had any children or not. They may have had children. I don't know that at all. But anyway, but at least they had dogs. And Agnes liked having Pomeranian dogs. Well, in Charleville, we had mongrel dogs, the occasional what we called kangaroo dogs, sheep dogs, blue heelers, all of that type of thing. But no. Agnes had Pomeranian dogs. And these Pomeranian dogs are these little yapping bloody things, and you'd walk past the fence and yap. Oh dear, they were up and down the fence, yapping bastards that they were. We hated them. But anyway, I did learn a lesson from that. Not that it wasn't exactly I learned a lesson, perhaps I learned a lesson about myself from those Pomeranian dogs. And you think, well, how can that be? Well, it could be this way. One dog must have disappeared or something like that, or maybe the dog passed on. I can't remember. But whatever it was, Agnes got a new young... She always had several of these bloody things. But she got this new young Pomeranian pup. And the young Pomeranian pup was small, but it was a yapper just like a big Pomeranian dog. And it too used to yap up and down the fence and so on. The fence on the Paris Street side didn't have circular arrangement of the wire. It had a sort of a series of triangles, I think. And anyway, we got to school one day, and you know how news would go around. There was news went around about Jack Walsh urinating from the veranda or the balcony rather, of the Holt's Hotel. And, there were other stories that went around, and they went around very quickly. Well, anyway, I got to school one day, and a story had gone around. A story had gone around that one of Mrs. Kirk's pups, Mrs. Kirk's Pomeranian, was dead, and it had died in a particularly tragic way. Now, I told you about the boy who pinched the 2 bob, or who attempted to pinch the 2 bob. Now, they had some great mastiff, probably a mongrel mastiff, but no, it was a great mongrel mastiff. And the story that went around the school was this: that the boy who pinched the 2, or who attempted to pinch the 2 bob, and his mongrel mastiff were walking past the school on the day before, when they were accosted through the fence by Mrs. Kirk's new Pomeranian pup. But because it was a new Pomeranian pup, the story was that it had got its head through the wire. Now, I don't believe that this second thing happened, but it must have been near to it. The story was that the 2 bob boy's mastiff had bitten the head off Mrs. Kirk's new Pomeranian pup. Well, I don't think that would have happened, but I think the mastiff took a bite at the Pomeranian pup, and the Pomeranian pup passed on. Well, there we are. The story went around. Well, we knew. They didn't have black drapery out, and Mrs. Kirk, nor old Borley for that matter, but Mrs. Kirk was not in bombazine, and old Borley hadn't arranged the services of Rice the Undertaker or anything like that. But we knew that the Kirk household would have been plunged into despair, particularly the female half of the household, and we knew Mrs. Kirk would be devastated. Well, it's there that I learned a lesson. I learned a lesson of my own capacity for hypocrisy. Now, before that, I wouldn't have even known what hypocrisy was. And if I had known of it, I would have disapproved of it. But on this occasion, I found myself overwhelmed by hypocrisy. Because I can't remember what year it was. But a number of us decided that we would form a delegation of condolence. And we would present ourselves to the back door of the house and offer Mrs. Kirk our condolences. This was the most brazen piece of activity, I can tell you, because we were delighted to hear that the 2 bob boy dog the mastiff had killed the Pomeranian dog. Heartless creatures that we were. But we were overjoyed because we wished no joy to old Borley, that's for sure. But nevertheless, we affected sympathy. We affected, all those finer feelings. And over we went, as a delegation, to express our sympathy to Mrs. Kirk. Well, I don't know whether she was moved by all of this. She wasn't moved to tears or anything, but she accepted the condolences of the delegation, and away we went. Okay, well, it was a small thing indeed. But it did teach me, though, that even I, this virtuous creature that I would have professed to be, was capable of the most brazen hypocrisy. And what was worse, I knew it at every step. I knew that we were joyful at the thought of this tragedy. I knew that we were joyful at the demise of this yapping mongrel, purebred Pomeranian. Oh dear, oh dear. So, that was a lesson for me. Now, whether, of course, I eschewed hypocrisy from that point in my life on, I do not know. I may have eschewed it a little bit. I may have eschewed it just a little bit. Because, maybe I have been hypocritical about some things. I try not to be. My big mouth tells me to at least try to be honest in all things, and I try to succeed, but no doubt I haven't. But the most brazen piece of hypocrisy was that one of the occasion of Agnes Kirk and the Pomeranian dog and the Mastiff and so on. Okay. Agnes features also in another story. It also involved Borley, of course, but Agnes was sort of in charge of this. In about 1946, 1947, I told you that the Duke of Gloucester came to Charleville to unveil the water fountain in memory of the young airman who had been killed in this plane crash. Well, one of the features of his time in Charleville was a reception, or whatever one might call it, at the Charleville State School. And so we were arranged under the house. That was the building directly. First you come to inside the gate. Fairly low-ceilinged house it was, low-ceiling building it was too. And I don't know, maybe there was a speech of welcome to the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester, possibly made by Borley himself, I don't know. But anyway, a number of us sat there. I don't know how many grades attended or whether the whole school attended, but, this was royalty. Royalty indeed, coming to Charleville and in the state school. But of course we had to prepare for this grand occasion, and the person at the centre of the preparations for the visit to the Duke of Gloucester rather, was Mrs. Kirk. She was in charge of the musical arrangements, the musical function. There were three things. We had a sort of a choir or something. We'll call it a choir. And Mrs. Kirk was in charge of the choir. Now, I do recall that I was one of the members, of course, and I must have been a sweet singer, sweet singer of the bush or something, I don't really know. Now, I know there were three pieces that we presented, and I can't remember the third one. Maybe it'll come to me at some of those stage. But we prepared Beautiful Dreamer, Awake Unto Me or something. But anyway, Beautiful Dreamer, that was one of the pieces. And then we did a little speech thing. Christopher Robin is saying his prayers or something. I don't know. But they were two of the three. I can't remember what the third one was. But anyway, one was Beautiful Dreamer. It must have been a popular song of the time or something. And the other one was a piece of sort of speech, Christopher Robin is saying, no, not singing, it was, verse type of thing. But anyway, I don't know whether the Duke of Edinburgh is impressed by this or not, but we went through our paces and we did it. But for me, though, the highlight of the occasion was the posy. The Duchess of Gloucester had to be presented with a posy. Well, I can't remember what time of the year it was, but I mean, sometimes in Charleville, getting the floral part of a posy presents something of a challenge. And it may well be that the posy was made up of oleander flowers or something. I don't know what was in the posy, but that really wasn't the principal problem. The principal problem was that if you give a posy, the posy has to have a handle and then it has to have a frilly bits, and then the flowers have to be in the middle. Now, the frilly bits around the side, I think, were probably provided by the serviettes of Coroni's Hotel. Now, I wouldn't be sure about that, but I think if I'd been doing the frilly bits, I would have gone and got, some fancy paper from Coroni's Hotel, and then we would have had someone artistic put some flowers. But the handle of the posy had to be elegant. It had to be of quality, you see. And a posy handle had to have a sort of a silver, it was a silver handle. But where in about 1946, 1947 do you find silver? Well, a bit difficult. There were two sources of silverish sort of paper. One of them was from inside tea chests. And but that wasn't really a very good quality, and it wasn't really made. But you needed a silver paper of greater substance. Well, the answer to them was this. Cigarette packets in those days had a sort of a silver paper lining. And the call went out. Ask your fathers or your grandfathers or your uncles, whoever you may know, bring in the silver paper from the cigarette packets. Well, as you well know, silver paper that's been in cigarette packets for any length of time stinks to high heaven of tobacco. Oh, pongy sort of stuff. No matter, it was silver. And I recall that the Duchess of Gloucester was given a posy with a handle that was artistically wrapped in layers of cigarette silver paper. It must have stank to high heaven. And as you well know, I don't think oleander has any particular aroma, and so the Duchess of Gloucester got this thing stinking of cigarettes. But anyway, it was the gift that was necessary to give, because that was all we had, and it was the best that could be given. Okay then. Well, now the third story connected with Old Borley was, and by Old Borley by extension, was the fancy dress ball. Now, if you go to the Charleville Times of those years, you'll find a report from November of each year of the Charleville State School Fancy Dress Ball, and it would list all of the students and what their costume was, and it was a very grand affair. And God, I look at it now and I can see Miss Edith Bealby and Miss Elsie Bealby, and apparently everybody went. You know, it was the done thing. Everybody had a fancy costume of some kind. Couldn't hire them or anything. You just had to make them up from home. Some people did very well, and others were rather more simply outfitted for that occasion. But it wasn't the outfits that were necessary or that were outstanding. What was interesting was that from our very earliest year and for the entire time that the Kirks were at the school, each year in November there was a fancy dress ball. And the fancy dress ball had a very strict, very special format. And we had to practice for the fancy dress ball for weeks and weeks beforehand. A piano was brought over and put down under the baby's building, about under Toddy Conley's class, or classroom rather. And Agnes would come over and she would play the piano. And she had a very stirring march that she would play. And the ceremony, as we'll call it, began. And the ceremony involved what was known as the Grand March. Okay, everyone would line up in pairs, and then you would go around and you'd march down in a pair. Then one pair would go to the left, one pair would go to the right, and there'd be singles. Then you would join up and you'd be a pair again. And then you'd come down and the pair would go to the left, the next pair would go to the right, and then they'd come to fours. The fours would come down, one to the left, one to the right, then they would form eights. Then they would come down, then they would go back to fours and twos and ones. And after you did all of this, it meant that every spectator in the hall had been able to have a good look at every person there who was in fancy dress. And I thought, well, this is just some Charleville peculiarity. This was, just what we did in Charleville. I didn't think there was anything special about it, but it was known as the Grand March. Well, it wasn't until, in my China years, I began thinking about the Grand March, and I don't know how I even began researching it, but maybe I just did something simple by going to Google and typing in the Grand March. Well, what I discovered was that the Grand March was a 19th century must. At all the great balls of Europe, in the 19th century perhaps the mid-19th century and on, and still in Charleville into the 1940s and even early 50s, the Grand March was the beginning part of any great ball. And we remember having a fancy dress ball, and we had to begin with the Grand March. And in Europe, in the great balls of Europe, they would begin with exactly the same thing, the Grand March. And people would go along, the ladies in their finery, the gentlemen all done up in whatever gentlemen were done up in those days. But you would do exactly the same thing, the Grand March, singles, doubles, fours, eights, splitting up once again, so that everybody, just as they were in Charleville, were able to see our costumes, of a stockman, whatever, even themes of the war found their way into the early years of the fancy dress balls. In the same way, the grand balls of Europe showed ladies and gentlemen in their finery. Now, it may have died out in Europe, maybe about the turn of the century, but it was still going in Charleville in the 1930s because Mrs. Kirk was very familiar with the Grand March, and she had a very wonderful Grand March tune. Same Grand March tune, she played it every single year. But it was a wonderful and stirring Grand March. And so that insofar as a ceremony that the whole town enjoyed and that we were well and truly trained in was the Grand March for the fancy dress ball. So while I think hard, I'm trying to think hard, of things that maybe fine things that old Bawley would have done, I would think very, very hard about that. I can only think of Bawley as doing the job that he thought should be done. And but it was not one that warmed your heart, I can assure you of that. But insofar as there are ceremonies, well, the Duke of Gloucester's visit was a ceremony, and Agnes had a big part in that. Each year, the fancy dress ball, Agnes had a big part of that. So the good things about old Bawley, really, the good thing really was Agnes. Agnes added so much to the school. She was a little uncomplaining sort of woman, probably loved her Pomeranian dogs and so on. But they were the ceremonies. And if you ask me, what other ceremonies did you have at the school? I can't think of any. I remember, old Bawley, he was just funny, strange fellow in some ways. This is a personal thing. When I did scholarship, I did very well. And I didn't know my result because my family had been in Melbourne in December and January of that particular year, and I didn't get back to Charleville until a day or two before school began. So everybody else knew their scholarship result, but I didn't know what my scholarship result was. And so I got to school on the very first day. By this time I'd theoretically moved into what you might theoretically call the high school. And I went to Mr. Kirk's office and said, Mr. Kirk, could I have my scholarship results, please? Well, as it was, I was one of the best marks in the state. Not in the top 10, but certainly it was good. Not far below that. And he just handed me the sheet of paper. He didn't say very good or anything like that. I just got the sheet of paper. Maybe he didn't like me, maybe I had a big mouth or something, I don't really know. But whatever it was, I would have thought that, if a kid had performed, and a kid from Lower King Street at that, had performed as well as all of that, you might have said, well, very good, well done. He could have found a big word, like a poser or cogitate or something like that, but he had no words. He just said, here you are. Away I went. So, what do we say? He was there a long time. He played bowls. He had a wife. She was, she liked the dogs. She was a good pianist. She helped out for the Duke of Gloucester. She helped out for the fancy dress ball and so on. But Borley just went around swishing the cane, thinking Kath Harriman was very lovely, and giving poses and striking fear into all and sundry, teachers included. So there we are. Look, there are probably 10,000 other things to be told about the school, but I value the school. I don't value what happened in the high school. It was just an absolute disgrace on the part of the department. I dare say that other Western towns were probably treated just as badly, but we were treated particularly badly, I thought, and it really doesn't matter. And obviously a few people in town were also, why didn't they put more pressure on the department? I really do not know, but they didn't. But the primary school, though, I thought was very, very good. And other than that young, grumpy creature, Brandt, the teachers, I thought, were generally very, very good, and I was very grateful. They seemed older to me, but they weren't old. They couldn't have been all that old. But they seemed to be very mature, but I admired them. And what I admired about them was that they had something to teach, and they believed in doing it. They believed in it, in this notion of transmission. They weren't interested in, let's discuss, let's argue, let's explore, let's be creative, let's do, what did that silly woman say? Let's do grief counselling or something? No. There was spelling, there was maths, there was English, and, whatever else that was really important, the basics. They got on with that. But the other thing about it was that they were people of substance, of real learning in a sense. Even with, Henry Schwanheimer led the way. But they managed to transmit this notion of, we will give you so much, but if you want the rest, you go and find it yourself. And that, I think, made for a very successful school. And so I was very, very grateful. I mean, I wasn't well served at all by what happened after I left the primary school. But I was well served by the primary school. That primary school was very, very good, and the teachers within it were very, very good, and the town was really well served by them. And so for them, I'm always very, very grateful. And there was also some other quality about it. I don't know whether it was a quality about the school or whether it was a quality about the town. It was no bullshit. Charleville was a no bullshit town. Don't try to be a bullshitter in town, because you're not going to get very far. And insofar as I acquired anything from the spirit of the town, I'm always grateful for that. Like my cousin Tom, or my father's cousin Tom Akers, lead, follow, or get out of the bloody road. Just get on with it. And so I've always been grateful to the school for that, and grateful to Charleville for that. That's why I take the trouble to do these these little, we'll call them history things, because I think it's good to have a record. Of course, there were other things about it. There was a terrible conformity about the school and the town. Boys could not wear long trousers, and you couldn't even buy a pair of long trousers because the accepted thing was boys didn't wear long trousers. We were poor, and so we didn't, we were never very warm. And the things that I remember always about Charleville was the cold. We were always cold. But we went there, and at night we never had enough blankets. God, we used to pile everything on the beds. But we probably weren't alone in that. There would have been many, many families like that. And, part of the conformity, boys didn't wear gloves. Boys didn't wear anything on their heads. So you just damn well froze. My mother used to go to Pall Mall, and she'd buy a fairly cheap jumper for us, and it might have been some sort of cheap wool or synthetic, but it was not really very warm. But what we were very lucky about, she wished to buy us, if she could, one fleecy line singlet, and that was our saviour. But Charleville had rules. The boys could wear, you could wear a white shirt, you could wear a blue shirt, you could wear a grey shirt, but nothing else. Nothing else. So there were all sorts of unspoken rules in Charleville. We were very, very conformist. I don't think that helped us very much. Times have changed, of course. And that's the negative that I remember. But the positive that I remember is that school. And I was very, very, and in a sense, regardless of what happened in the high school, the primary school provided me with a foundation. And if you like, a sort of philosophical foundation as far as education is concerned. The school can do so much and take it. And the school was determined to do as much as it could. And it gave. But our task was to take what was given and then to add to it. And I just didn't get that from home, and I didn't get them outside the school fence, but I got that from those teachers in that school. And so even all these years on, 84 and not out, I'm still grateful for what I found within the fence of the Charleville State School.